if you're like me, when we grew up, we learned about the Underground Railroad as something that happened on the East Coast. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and all that. In fact, more people escaping their enslavement came through Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio than ever went up the East Coast. And so this is a whole new way that we've got to think about this part of American history. And the heart of it all are the stories and the journeys of the freedom seekers themselves. The people that escaped enslavement in the 19th century were known as fugitive slaves. And there is the horrific Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. But part of what we need to understand at the very beginning is that fugitive slave is a 19th century category of property, right? When I do my research, I look for tax records and estate sales where I find the horses and the pigs and the sheep and the cows and the slaves. All right, not people, but property. And in response to that, today, and you'll notice that in what I do, I talk about freedom seekers. That is because there's been an agreement across the country that as we look at this part of our American history, let's understand the activity of enslaved people running for their freedom, not in terms of being a category of property, but in terms of their deep human intention to be free people. And so we call them freedom seekers. But of course, it's exactly the same thing. 19th century language, fugitive slaves, 21st century language, freedom seekers. But we are talking about the people that were enslaved and decided by whatever means necessary that they were going to be free. That as people who were going for the North Star, headed north up the Mississippi River Valley, they would know from everybody that the point you need to get to is Chicago. Chicago was both a great destination for people on the way to freedom, and it was also a great stopping point. So if you can imagine, what we are experiencing is thousands of people who, on their way to freedom, literally came through our backyards. And this is not, this is not history over there. That is history right here, and it's history right in our own communities. And Native peoples here, 10 to 12,000 years ago, permanently settled here after the 1750s, and those folks were part of the Council of Three Fires, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Ottawa. And they are, as we talk about the legacy of the land and acknowledging that we are on the ancestral land, it's of the Council of Three Fires, predominantly Potawatomi, but the three major groups. Other, the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Illini, a lot of other folks came through at one point or another, but we talk about the Council of Three Fires. And from time to time, we're going to see things on the CalSag channel. This is the original Little Calumet River. So the question immediately comes to mind, why are we standing on this raggedy bridge? Okay, there is a very, very remarkable story. I want you to imagine in the 1830s and 1840s and 50s that Chicago was a small town. 20 to 30,000 residents, and Chicago was basically the size of the Loop. Right? Now, we are standing exactly 15 miles south of downtown Chicago, which means we are standing 15 miles directly south of what was Chicago. And we now know that hundreds of people that had made their way to Chicago took lake steamers and went around up Lake Michigan and around Michigan to get to Detroit and then freedom in Canada. We also know that a significant number of people walked or came on buggies or wagons and walked that 200 miles from Chicago to Detroit to then get to the river, cross over, and get into Canada. The historic road from Chicago to Detroit came right through here. There are very, very few places in the United States where we know exactly where freedom seekers walked. 500 to 800 people on their way to freedom walked right here. And I hope someday we're going to have a sign But when you're on Michigan Avenue in Roseland, or when you go across this bridge, carry that memory, that reality with you. My Lord, 500 to 800 people who had done everything they could possibly do to protect themselves and their children got to Chicago and then were on their way to freedom, and they came right here.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Gods are gonna trouble the water. Wade, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Gods are gonna trouble the water.
Okay, so now we are in. Now we are in what is now called the Cal-Sag Channel. This was developed at the beginning of the 20th century, and it follows the course of what was the Little Calumet River. The river was about 60 to 80 feet wide, and of course this is somewhere around 300 feet or more wide. This is part of the Illinois waterway system, which takes barges like the one we saw going from the Mississippi River into the Great Lakes. Now, if we kept floating in this direction, we would end up in New Orleans, right? And if we turned the canoes around and paddled in the other direction, eventually going through the Great Lakes, we would end up going past Montreal and going down the St. Lawrence River and in the Atlantic Ocean. So right from this point, going west is one way, going east is totally the other way, which means we're sitting on a continental divide. And the reason that Chicago exists where it is because it's the transition point between the Great Lakes water system and the Mississippi River Valley water system. And so freedom seekers that made their way to Chicago knew they had to go on to Detroit, and so the first thing they had to do was come south 15 miles to get across the Little Calumet River and then go around into northwest Indiana, Michigan, and on to Detroit, and then Canada. This was part of the original farm of Jan and Angie Tunn, Dutch immigrants who settled here in the late 1840s, 1849, and the Dutch immigrants settled in what we know as Roseland and what we know as South Holland. The name South Holland gives it away. But Roseland was also originally a Dutch immigrant community, and then there were Dutch farmers that spread out along the historic road. Now, recognize that we're sitting about 6 blocks from that historic road, and so freedom seekers coming down out of the city found some help with these Dutch farmers that were living here. In 1857, Cornelius Kuiper was approached at his farm up on Michigan Avenue. He was approached by 2 slave catchers. And you need to know that after the horrendous federal law, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, you were mandated anywhere in the country, if you are called upon to help find a fugitive, you have to do that. If you do not, you could be fined up to $1,000. In today's money, that's $20,000 fine. Or you could be thrown in jail for a year. So this was very serious business. So because he was a leader of the community, when these 2 slave catchers came down, he said, "Sure, I'll help you." And so he got on his horse, and the 2 slave catchers and Kuiper, they came down the historic trail over the Indiana Avenue Bridge. They went over to Hammond. Every farm that they stopped at, every person they saw, "Have you seen these 3 fugitives?" They described them. And no information. And they came back, and then they came over and they stopped at the Tunn farm to see if the Tunns had seen the 3 fugitives. And no, they hadn't been here. So these 2 slave catchers are really dejected because they have lost the equivalent of $45,000 in property. The going recovery cost for a fugitive was $800. That translates in today's money about 15,000. So if you can imagine, these slave hunters were really dejected. They were out $45,000. And so Kuyper was very sympathetic and very supportive. As a matter of fact, as they were dejected, Kuyper even rode halfway back to Chicago to kind of show his concern. And then they took off for Chicago, and Kuyper rode back to his farm, and he got off his horse, and guess what he did? He went into his barn, he invited 3 men to come in for dinner. And that is very serious business.
They sold my children away, Lord. They sold my children away. They sold my children away. I wish I never was born. Lord, come here. Lord, come here. Lord, come here. I wish I never was born. I wish I never was born. I wish I never was born.
And we believe this is the only dirt street in the city of Chicago. And again, recognize where we are and the historical legacies of racism. It's no accident that this area has no electricity, no sewers, no gas, and the streets are rough. Remember that people were, for the most part, walking. And in the South, things were very serious. They had to always travel at night. Southern Illinois was really southern, and so people also traveled at night. Over time, people began to understand through their connections with the Network Underground Railroad that once you got into central Illinois, you really could travel during the daytime. You had to be discreet, you had to be very careful, but you could travel during the daytime. And as people came into northern and central Illinois, they found all kinds of black families and white families that responded to them. And people were glad to open their houses. Freedom seekers slept in barns, next to fireplaces, the extra bedroom or whatever. All of the stories in northern Illinois about secret rooms, about tunnels, about passageways, that's all folklore. There's no evidence of any of that. So as people talk about it, and think about it as a human encounter. If you owned a farm and a family shows up on your doorstep and says, gee, can you help us? We need a place to sleep, or could we have a little food or whatever, what are you gonna do? You know, human to human, you're gonna say, well, of course, how do we help? And so rather than think about it as elaborate, secrecy and all that kind of stuff, rather think about it as this remarkable human encounter of people on the run finding other people that said, well, yeah, we'll help you. And that was always a family decision.
'Cause you're running for your freedom. Sit down, child. Sit down and rest a little while. Oh, sit down, children, sit down. I know you're tired. Sit down, 'cause you've come a long way. Sit down, child. Sit down and rest a little while. Oh, you've come a long way. And you had hard trials. And I know you're tired. Sit down, child.
And I'd like to tell you the story of John and Eliza Little. John and Eliza were enslaved on adjoining farms in western Tennessee. They arrived there in the late 1830s. John had had a tough life. John was born in Virginia. His parents were among the last Africans that were brought in chains from Africa to Virginia. And John grew up enslaved, but with a clear sense of himself. And later on, he told people that he was always clear. He would say to them, "I know who I am. I am the son of African princes." Needless to say, that kind of clarity could create problems. And all of his life, he bore scars on his back, a bullet fragment in his shoulder. And eventually, after being enslaved in Virginia and sold to Kentucky and then finally Tennessee. Well, Eliza was enslaved on an adjoining farm. Eliza and John met each other, fell in love, got married, and realized that if they had any life together, they would have to escape. So in the spring of 1841, right? 1841, they decided that they were going to go for their freedom. And so the two of them gathered up a few belongings. They met in the middle of the night, and they knew, they had talked with a number of people, they understood where they were going, that they could follow the Tennessee River north. In western Tennessee and western Kentucky, the Tennessee River flows north to join the Ohio River just at the bottom of Illinois. So John and Eliza got to the Tennessee River, and they were following it up to, and as they got close to the Ohio River, there was a large swampy area. And John remembered years ago, he said, "I found a floating log, and I put Eliza on that log, and I put our belongings behind her, and I pushed that log through the swamp, knowing that if I misstepped, I would lose all that I loved." And John did not misstep. They made it to the Ohio River, and they borrowed a boat, and they took that boat, they got across the Ohio River, and they were exhausted. They had been walking for weeks and had now made it into the southern edge of Illinois. They stopped by the north side of the Ohio, and they built a campfire, and they were just kind of collecting themselves and getting ready for their next journeys. Just so happens, some other freedom seekers had also crossed the Ohio at about the same time, saw their campfire, and came over. And these other people were really discouraged. And they said, "We've been walking too much. This is too long. Why, maybe, we're just a couple miles from Cairo. Maybe if we walk over to Cairo and turn ourselves in, they could get us back to our masters, and maybe you wouldn't punish us. Like if we turned ourselves in, maybe, what do we do?" And in the midst of that, Eliza Little stood up, and Eliza said to them, "I know where I have been, and I know where I must go, and if needs be, I will walk barefoot to Chicago for my freedom." And John and Eliza walked from the Ohio River 370 miles, walked to get to Chicago. They made it. They got lake steamers up Lake Michigan and around to Detroit, and they lived for many, many years and had a really great life in Canada. But can you imagine? Can you imagine not only the stamina and the courage, but just the remarkable toll on your life if you have to do that kind of thing so you can be a free person?